The scripture reading Esther 4:14. Esther 4:14. For ye remain completely silent at this time. Relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
Well, we've been studying in the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah, as you know from that old worn-out timeline that I've been giving you that's in front of you now. We've mentioned that the Esther happened between the building of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls. I thought we'd just take a moment and talk about Esther. Why should we leave her out? I believe that you know the story, about 479 BC. The whole story goes something like this. It's a lot. It's power-packed. It's action-packed. It has irony. It has providence of God. It has so much in it that we could study it for a long time, but I'm going to try to give an overview very quickly tonight. In chapter 1, Ahasuerus, the king, or Xerxes, from the time period that you noticed on the timeline, right before Artaxerxes, who presided over the rebuilding of the walls. During the time of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as he was sometimes called, he reigned over a great empire. The Persian Empire was reigning all the way from India to the east and Ethiopia to the west. It had a great empire, and he was doing well. For some reason, Ahasuerus decided to throw a feast, a big party. This party is something beyond anything that we ever imagined. It lasted 180 days. It lasted about half of a year. This party did. It was for the high officials of the land. And after that party that he threw, this great feast that had all the fine decorations and had these individually molded chalices for the people to drink out of, he decided to throw another party for people great and small, so the common people could come too. And that feast lasted a week. While he was throwing that week-long feast, his queen Vashti had a feast for the ladies of the land. On the seventh day of King Ahasuerus' feast, when he was merry with wine, the Bible says, he thinks it would be a good idea for his wife to come over to his feast and show her great beauty to all the drunken men at his feast. He bids her to come, and she says no. You didn't do that in the Persian court. No matter if you were the queen, she said, no, I'm not coming. So Ahasuerus was kind of confused by this, kind of stunned. It's almost comical. He wonders, he gathers with his cabinet, like in the situation room or something, and says, what do we do about this? She said no to me. What do we do? One of them finally comes up with the idea, Memucan comes up with the idea that this has to be dealt with. We can't have a wife disobeying her husband. So Memucan suggests that there be a decree written by the king and sent out to all the provinces in all their own language, to all the peoples. And that decree should declare that every man should be master of his house and master of his wife. And that Vashti would be dethroned. She wouldn't be queen any longer. And that's how chapter 1 ends. In chapter 2, then, the Bible starts with these three words. After these things. After these things, when the king of Ahasuerus, when his wrath subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. He thinks, boy, I miss Vashti. I wish I hadn't done that, maybe he was thinking. He wants the comfort of his queen. He wants the comfort of his wife. Now, make no mistake, he had a whole harem of wives, as we'll figure out. This was a very polygamous society. They did not follow God's rules and instructions for marriage. The Jews didn't either sometimes. God's rules were one man and one woman for life, but they often had their higher-ups have many, many, many wives in many places in the East and many places around the world still do today. He had many wives, but he remembered Vashti and wanted her back. But he couldn't get her back, so the king's servant suggested something to him instead. He said, let's go send our men throughout the city and let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of all the kingdoms, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. So there's a roundup. There's a trafficking operation, if you will, on behalf of the king to find his next queen. And it's not by will, it's not by consent, it's not a Hollywood marriage, it's not fall in love. It's that the king sends his men throughout all the provinces to get the most beautiful young women who've never been with a man and bring them to the custody of Haggai, the custodian of the women, and help them be more beautiful. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, chapter 2, verse 5, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who'd been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. In 597 BC, Jeconiah had lost his kingdom after only 3 months' reign. There was a great captivity, the second captivity. Kish was one of the Jews that had been carried captive at that time. He eventually would have a son named Shimei, who would eventually have a son named Jair, who would eventually have a son named Mordecai. And all of these would stay in captivity. Even through the rebuilding of the temple, this family stayed in captivity. Even through the spiritual revival of Ezra, this family stayed in captivity. Even through the rebuilding of the walls, this family stayed in captivity. And we don't know why. Did they not have the means to get back? Did they not have the desire to get back? We don't know, but they stayed in captivity. Mordecai had a cousin whose name was Hadassah, also Esther. Her parents had been killed, we don't know how, but Mordecai had raised this young cousin of his as his own, loved her very, very much. She was one of those rounded up by the king's men to be taken to Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women. So it was that these young women had all kinds of beauty preparations that were given to them. For a year, they prepared themselves. For 6 months, they had one certain kind of preparation. For another 6 months, they had another kind of preparation. For a year, they prepared themselves, and then they went in for one night with the king. And the contest was, before any reality show came along and defiled marriage the way they have since Bachelor, before any of that came along, here's the defilement of marriage by this king calling in woman after woman after woman to be with him and to decide which one was going to be the next queen. Esther didn't have any choice in the matter. Didn't seem. So she went through the motions. She didn't ask anything extra of Haggai. She showed herself to be humble. She showed herself to be not one who was proud and not one who was bullying and not one who wanted more attention. But when it was all said and done, she was chosen to be the next queen. This little Jewish girl who was in captivity in the Persian Empire, whose great-grandfather had been taken captive, was now the queen over all the world empire that Persia ruled. Mordecai wanted to know what was going on with her, so he'd hang around. He'd hang around in the king's gate. He'd hang around close to where he could hear things. And one of these times he heard something maybe he wished he hadn't heard. There were two eunuchs of the king's, Bigthan and Terrace, who wanted the king dead, and they were conspiring a plot to assassinate the king. Mordecai heard about it, reported it. It was investigated, and Bigthan and Terrace were put to death. That's chapter 2. In chapter 3, for some reason, we have this beginning phrase again, after these things. For some reason, King Ahasuerus promoted a man by the name of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above all the princes who were with him. We don't know what Haman did to deserve this. We don't know why he was advanced, but he was above all the princes and kings, and we find out in chapter 3 that everybody had to bow to him. And they did, but not Mordecai. We don't know why Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. I've always assumed it was because Mordecai was a good Jew and would only bow to someone who was his God and not to anybody else. I'd like to still believe that, but the fact of the matter is the scriptures don't tell us why Mordecai, to my knowledge, would not bow to Haman. But it drove Haman nuts. He had everybody in the kingdom bowing to him. He had the king's pleasure. He had the audience of the king. But one fellow wouldn't bow to him, and it just drove him completely bonkers. So instead of trying to just deal with that one man, or instead of just swallowing a little bit of pride and letting everybody else bow to him and fluffing off old Mordecai, he decides he's going to get Mordecai. But he's not just going to get Mordecai. He's going to get all his people. He's going to have all the Jews killed. So he suggests to the king, and the king had this kind of character where he said, okay, just do it, that's fine. He suggests to the king that they draw lots, and they set a day on which all the Jews and all the empire, really all the world, would be killed. They set the day as the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and they send out a decree with the king's royal signet ring and his seal. They send it to all the provinces so everybody can read in his own language, and everybody gets this message in the mail one day. It's one of these mass mailings you might think of in today's terms that says, on the 13th of the month of Adar, you are commanded to go out and kill every Jew you see. The end of chapter 3 says that the king and Haman sat down to have a drink, but the capital city of Shushan was perplexed. Why would we get this? Why would he want everybody dead? Why do we have to do this? Now keep in mind, you're not in a democracy where you can protest this. This is the law. This is the king's law. And the laws of the Medes and the Persians, we learned from the book of Daniel a little earlier, could not be changed. So once this is law, it's law. And you're commanded to go out, and if you let a Jew live, you might just likely lose your life. The city was perplexed. In chapter 4, Mordecai starts out the chapter by crying out loud, putting himself in sackcloth and ashes. He went into the midst of the city and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And the people were weeping and wailing all over the place in every province that there was. So Esther, the queen of the empire, the one that you'd think had some say, you'd think would be in charge, had no idea what was going on. All the common people knew the law. The queen was confined to her quarters under the guard of the eunuchs and didn't know anything that was going on in the land. This is how they treated their women. Esther sends one of her eunuchs to Mordecai to say, "Why are you crying so loudly?" He sends back and tells her of the king's decree. He tells her of the things that are going on and how all the Jews are going to be killed. And he tells her, "Esther, you're the queen. You need to do something about this." Then we find out just a little bit more about how they treated their women. She's the queen of the empire, but she's not allowed to go see the king unless he calls her. And he hadn't called her in 30 days. So the queen of the empire hasn't spent overnight with her husband in the palace for a month. She hadn't been called into him for 30 days. And she knows that another law. If you go to the king without being called, there's one law. You're put to death. Unless he happens to be in a good mood and extends the scepter when you walk into the room. She tells Mordecai essentially, "I can't do this. There's nothing I can do about this." Mordecai sends back to her and says in verse 13, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews." You're a Jew too. Your life's on the line now. "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place." Now, how did he know that? We'll propel ourselves to one of the great lessons of the book, but that is the providence of God. It comes up now, we might as well address it. How did he know that relief and deliverance would arise from another place if she remained silent? Because they were the people of God. Because God had promised through Abram that the Christ would come through them. Because God had promised that to Isaac and promised it to Jacob, that through their seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Because he had promised it in the book of Isaiah 300 years before this. Because he had promised it in the book of Daniel in some terms about 100 years before this. Because God had kept promising that the Christ would come to save the world. Because Christ was preordained before the foundation of the world. And God said he would come through the nation of Israel and through the tribe of Judah and through the lineage of David. There's no way that the Jewish nation could end now because Christ hadn't come yet. God keeps his promises. It appears to me, although the text doesn't say explicitly, but it sure appears to me that Mordecai knew that. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And then come those chilling lines. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows but what God put you here right now for just this purpose. Who knows but what God took Kish into captivity and had him have Shimei and Jair stayed in captivity and had Mordecai, and your parents died and Mordecai rose you, and you just happened to be at the place where they were picking up young virgins to go into the king, and the king just happened to choose you. Who knows whether God put you in this place at this time for this purpose, to save your people so that Christ could come. Those are chilling lines. Esther musters her courage and says, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." I don't mean to paint these characters as perfect people. Nobody's been perfect except Christ. But this is one of the most stirring examples of courage you will ever see anywhere. I know it's against the law. I'm the queen, but it's against the law to go to him. Yeah, I haven't been there for a month, but I'll go to him on behalf of the Jews, and if I die, well, I die. In chapter 5, she's going to go to the king. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. I'd like to get a picture of that setup, because there are so many things that happen in these chapters because of the setup that he had. The king apparently was in his throne room, but he had a pretty good view of what was going on in the court or in the hallway or something. Esther was out there. When he saw Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight, and he held out that golden scepter that was in his hand. That meant she was not going to die. Furthermore, he offered her anything she wanted. "What is it you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you. Up to half the kingdom. You can have 49% of the stock in this kingdom. I'll give it to you. Whatever you want." That's how much he loved Esther. Esther says, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today for the banquet that I have prepared for him." She's made food. She's made a banquet. Oh, okay, we'll have a banquet. So they go get Haman. They bring him to the banquet. And at the banquet, when the king opens his mouth, he says to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." And this is perplexing to me. It probably shouldn't be, but I'm not that swift sometimes. Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Some people suggest she got nervous. I want to tell you what it is, but I got a banquet tomorrow. Yeah, that's it. And then I'll tell you tomorrow what it is. I don't know about that. Maybe she's trying to butter him up more, some people have said. I don't know. It could be a whole lot of things that have to do with human thought processes. Haman went out of that banquet that day just as proud as he could be, buttons popping, until he saw Mordecai not bowing to him. Then he went home and pouted, called his friends in, called his wife in. "What am I going to do? All this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zeresh, kind of like a Jezebel, she and his friends said to him, "Well, I'll tell you what you do, Haman. You build a gallows outside your house, 50 cubits high. That'd be 75 feet high. That'd be like, 7.5 stories of golden towers down there. Build a gallows 75 feet high outside your house, and in the morning, you got the king's ear. Go to the king and say, Mordecai needs to be hanged on those gallows." Good idea. So overnight, those gallows are built. But overnight, something else happens too. The king can't sleep. He has insomnia. And he doesn't do like my mother and put in one of my sermon CDs. He needs something to cure his insomnia. So what he does is he has somebody bring the book of the Chronicles to him. The book of the Chronicles of the king. I mean, he's not going to lower himself to read in some novel. Well, there weren't that many things to read at that time. And there was no TV. What do? If you're the king and you can't sleep? Well, you have somebody come serve you. What do you want to do? Read the Chronicles. Read a history book. I'll fall asleep to that. But he didn't fall asleep to it. It happened to be read. It just happened to be read that night. The place where Mordecai had informed on Bigthan and Terrace wanting to kill the king. It stirred the king up. It was almost morning. He couldn't sleep. He said, "What's been done for Mordecai to honor him?" Nothing. Right about that time, Haman is in the outer court, probably about where Esther was for the banquet. And Haman's there to ask for Mordecai's death. But Haman is seen by the king, and he says, Haman, come in here. I have a hypothetical question for you, Haman. I got somebody I want to honor. What should I do for somebody I want to honor? What should be done for the person whom the king delights to honor? Now, you know what Haman's thinking. Haman's thinking the king's going to honor me. So Haman lays it on thick. He says, get a royal robe that the king has worn, and get a royal horse on which the king has ridden, and put the royal crest on the head of that horse, and have one of the king's men, one of the king's princes, not just the eunuchs, but one of the king's princes, go around and lead that man around and say, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. The king says, that's a good idea, Haman. You go do that for Mordecai. So Mordecai is the one. Can you imagine the gritting of teeth? He wouldn't have had any molars left, would he? The gritting of teeth that he did when he does that, he takes that horse by the hand and he walks Mordecai around. Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. You know, that sort of thing. It's a great irony. And then in chapter 7, well, at the end of chapter 6, he goes home again to his wife Zeresh, tells her what happened. You know what she says to him? She's real encouraging this time. She says in verse 13, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. You're done, his wife says to him. Somehow she knew something about God's protection of the Jews, maybe. I don't know. In chapter 7, it's the second day. The banquet is on. Queen Esther has the king and Haman to the banquet. And they have the banquet, and the king repeats his statement to Esther. What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Queen Esther then gathers her courage and says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could not compensate for the king's loss. Ahasuerus is angry. Who would do this? Who would set up to kill the queen's people? She said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. The king is so angry that he gets up and leaves the room, probably to control himself. While he's leaving the room, Haman gets on his knees, starts begging for his life, backs up Esther, falls onto the couch where she is. He's on top of Esther. When the king walks back in, he's having a bad day. And the king says, will he assault the queen while I'm in the house? At that point, some eunuch that had it out for Haman steps out from behind the scenes, almost like from behind a curtain, says, hey, king, there's a gallows that Haman built for Mordecai outside his house last night. Good, hang Haman on those gallows. So Haman had to parade Mordecai around and say, thus it shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. And Haman is the one hang on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. And to wrap up the rest of the book real quickly, in chapter 8, Esther receives the household, the estate of Haman. There's another decree that is written that allows the Jews to defend themselves. That used to always perplex me till I asked a good friend about it. Why is it that that's such a big deal? He can't revoke the law that people should go out and kill Jews on the 13th of the day of the 12th month. The Persians didn't do that. What he can do is write an executive order that says the Jews can defend themselves. What good does that do? Aren't they going to do that anyway? What good that does is that takes the police and puts them on the side of the Jews. They're going to follow the latest edict. Otherwise, the police would have been involved in killing the Jews. Now the police are involved in defending the Jews. And as a matter of fact, many people converted to Judaism during this time. And then in chapter 9, the Feast of Purim is established, which means lots, because they cast lots for those days. And the Jews still celebrate that Feast of Purim to celebrate the time that Esther delivered her people. And we learn a little bit about Mordecai's rise to power as second in the kingdom after that. Now, in the few minutes I have left, allow me to give you just a little bit more historical context. There's that timeline that I've been giving you, focused in a little bit more. You see, in Esther chapter 1, verse 3, it says that the feasts that were happening that caused Vashti's removal were happening in the third year of the reign of Ahasuerus. He started reigning in 486 BC, so that would be 483 BC. He started calling those feasts together. You know what's happening in the Persian and the Greek empires at that time if you read your history books? Ahasuerus, Xerxes, is getting ready for war. His father had been defeated at the Battle of Marathon, remember that, in 490 BC? His father had suffered some humiliating losses, and since Ahasuerus became king, he's spending 4 years getting a supply line, in effect, to go attack Greece, getting things in order. And some have even suggested that this great 180-day feast was for all the people of all his provinces to come and to tell them about the plans for the war. It's possible, if the timing lines up. Anyway, it was 483 BC when Vashti was deposed, about 3 or 4 years before something else happens, the Battle of Thermopylae. You might know that from the graphic novel or the movie that was advertised. I didn't see it because I want to see that much violence. The movie The 300. It's where the Persians came with thousands of forces. Sometimes it's been estimated as many as 1 million forces, but the more conservative estimates say 300,000. And the Grecians had very few people from their city-states like Sparta. They found a narrow pass at Thermopylae and thought that they could ward off the Persians there, and they did for several days. And Ahasuerus is becoming agitated and being feared for his own life. They warded him off. And then when they warded him off, for a while, there was some traitor, shepherd, who took some of the Persians up this secret passageway and told them how they could encircle the people at Thermopylae in that pass. So when Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, the king of the Greeks, leading that army, found that out, he sent most of the army home to preserve them and left just 300 Spartans there, and some say maybe some others from some other cities, to fight to the death to give the other in the army time to get away. And finally, after incurring heavy losses, Ahasuerus' army beat Leonidas' army, and all those Spartans died. But the great moral victory was won, so that just a month later, at the naval battle of Salamis, Ahasuerus was defeated and went home in embarrassment. And that would have been about 479 BC, or if you look at chapter 2, verse 16, the 7th year of his reign. That's when Esther was taken to the palace. So there were 4 or 5 years between the dethroning of Vashti and the appointing of Esther to be queen. During that time, the king has gone to war, been at war for some time, come home defeated, and then he remembers Vashti. It's like a defeated king comes home wanting to cry to his wife, and then he remembers, oh yeah, I put her away. Then he gets Esther. And then after Esther comes along, the king seeks comfort in that wife. And then finally, chapter 3, verse 7, I don't have that slide exactly right, but chapter 3, verse 7, in the first month, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, 3 or 4 more years pass while Esther is queen, till it's 474 when all of this takes place, that he's going to destroy all the Jews. There's something else that fits in here of which you ought to be aware. It's from the book of Daniel. Remember in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel had predicted that there would be the Babylonian kingdom, as we know it now, that would have been followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom, that would have been followed by the Grecian kingdom, that would have been followed by the Roman kingdom, and in the days of that Roman kingdom, Christ would set up his church. The history books will say that from 499 BC to 449 BC is when Persia was losing to Greece. Here are some key battles in which Persia loses to Greece for Greece to become the next world empire. God is unfolding the history that he predicted internationally while keeping the Jews safe from this conniving little plot back at home in Persia with Esther. God does far imaginably above all that we ask or imagine. Ephesians chapter 3 verses 20 and 21 indicates God is the one who rules the nations and gives it to the lowest of men. Daniel chapter 4 verse 17. He rules over the nations. Psalm 47 verse 8 says, God is the one who keeps all of this going. What lessons do we learn? God saves his people. There's a crisis averted. The course of prophesied history continues. What good would it have been if God had allowed the Persian kingdom to be followed by the Grecian kingdom and the Roman kingdom, but back in the Persian kingdom they wiped out all the Jews and Christ couldn't come? God kept it all going and made sure that the Holy Spirit recorded it all for us. And then Christ's pathway was cleared. There were several crises throughout history that could have cost us the Christ. The flood. If the world had ended then, nobody would have ever been saved because Christ wouldn't have come yet. Hadn't even established the nation of Israel yet. But God made sure that Christ got here for you and for me. And we ought to see in this story how God and his providence works. There's no miracle recorded in this story. There's not even a dream recorded in this story. The name of God is not in this story. But you see that all these things don't just happen together, don't you? It's the providence. God provides providence for his people. Let's take that with us this week and try to be strong Christians, knowing that God always provides for his people. If you're not a Christian, we'd hope you would be. The thing to do is confess Christ, that you believe in him, repent of your sins, be baptized for the remission of sins, and then be faithful to him, loving him, serving him all the days of your life. If you've not been serving him, come back. If you've never been baptized, let us help you. If we could help you, please come forward as we stand and sing.